Now, I guess we should go on to read the poem that we're going to do together. And we thought we'd do this in two voices.
Okay.
We're not giving you it on the screen. It's called Poetic, Citizenship, and Negative Dialectics. It's something I wrote for a symposium at the CUNY Graduate Center, your alma mater, organized by Q Lee. She asked me to do something. And so this concept of writing about poetic citizenship, is an interesting one, and one that's very much along my lines, although the responsibility as a citizen isn't the same as the responsibility to being a poet. So I'm going to read, this is all consisting of statements and then kind of contradictions in italic in a different voice. And Tanya has graciously agreed to read the italics, and I'm going to read the Roman. And she makes a cameo appearance herself in this essay. Poetry is best that governs least.
No, it isn't.
Poetry and citizenship are inconsolably incommensurable, conjoined at the heart, but beating time to different drummers.
From time to time.
Aesthetic justice is symbolic and dwells next to, not in, the world of political action.
Give me a break.
The politics of poetic form is averse to the form of political prose.
In your dreams.
The kind of poetry I want is precarious and extreme. The kind of citizenship I want is neither.
As if you can have it both ways.
Accessibility is to prose what opacity is to poetry.
As in, a long walk is better than a short pier?
The dollar value of poetry can be calculated as the square root of the sublime times the negative sum of utopia divided by the excess derivative of an originality.
You wish.
The kind of poetry I want questions norms of identity by rocking and roiling. It traffics in error and errancy. It's a querulous query, but that's not the only kind of poetry I want.
You could fool me, buddy.
When language grapples with the unfamiliar or repressed, it will more likely sound strange than familiar.
The strange is pretty familiar to me.
Politics speaks truth to power. Poetry speaks truth to truth.
Poetry is necessarily plural. Its strands are inimical to one another.
Poetry is just as vital when it is refused by public space as when it occupies public space. The question is not why discomforting poetry, to use a phrase of Tanya Foster's. The question is not why discomforting poetry doesn't have a public voice in America today, but why that voice is cast aside.
The question is not, is poetry dead again, but why are you dead to poetry?
Poetry is not an export product of suffering or beauty, solidarity or despair, but a domain of freedom shrouded in veils, an unextractable aesthetic core.
Poetry is a form of lamentation, not to split cares, an expression of lamentation.
Aesthetic justice turns an otherworldly eye to family, nation, community, rationality. Poetry so conceived is of the earth, not of the world. This is how poetry matters in the world.
Aesthetic privilege is a negative market force, an active agent of loss.
Poetry emerges from difficult life in spite of as much as a a result of.
So much depends upon spite.
The promise of poems, the kind of poetry I want, is that it refuses reality.
But is it good for the Jews?
But is it good for the Jews? It's a good one. To be a poetic citizen is not to act as a citizen, but to perform as a poet. But there can be no citizenship without poetry. Even citizenship is symbolic. Citizenship that refuses dialogue with the delirious, wanton, discomforting possibilities of poetry approaches nativism.
Get off your low horse.
If citizenship is the first language of the Democrat, then poetry is a second language that, out of love and deep need, refuses to obey its mother tongue.
Poetry has no purpose, and that is not its purpose. Huh. When did you write this, Charles?
Well, it's probably written in the back. It's maybe like 4 years ago for the symposium.
Right. I'm just
Boy, I
thinking.
can hear birds. Is that birds in your backyard?
So there are birds, and then they have this beautiful wind chime, and then I think there's a